The Zulu victory over the British at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879 was the greatest defeat the British Army ever suffered at the hands of a non-European army in Africa. Over 1,300 of the 1,800 garrison were wiped out. 22-year-old Samuel Wassall was the only man to survive the carnage of the battle and be awarded Britain's highest medal for valour, the Victoria Cross. But apart from a road named after him in the Midlands, he is pretty much a forgotten hero. So what did this young soldier actually do to earn the VC? And how did he escape the nightmare at Isandlwana? This is the incredible story of Samuel Wassall VC. Samuel Wassall was born in the Aston area of Birmingham in 1856, the son of Elizabeth and Thomas, who was a wiremaker in a nearby foundry. By 1871 the family were living in Dudley in the nearby Black Country, where 15-year-old Samuel was apprenticed as a dyer. We don't know whether he was seeking adventure or simply pastures new like many other working class men at the time, but 3 years later he enlisted in the army, joining the 80th Regiment of Foot, the South Staffordshire Volunteers. Within a year, Private 427 Samuel Wassall was serving in one of the 3 companies of the regiment that took part in the Perak War on the Malayan Peninsula in Southeast Asia. After a posting to Singapore, he, along with the rest of the 80th Regiment, landed in South Africa in June 1877. Their arrival coincided with the outbreak of hostilities on the eastern borders of the British Cape Colony with the Xhosa people. This was the 9th such border war that the Xhosas had fought with Europeans, the first 3 with Dutch settlers, and then later on with the British. In a mobile war where the Xhosa fought a hit-and-run style of conflict, the Imperial forces were short of mounted men, and so a call went out for volunteers. The young man, brought up in the industrial Midlands of England, stepped forward. Wassall was assigned to the mounted infantry. In what was a comparatively swift campaign, the British commander, Lieutenant General Thesiger, brought the war to a conclusion in July 1878. Staying on as commander of the British forces in South Africa, Thesiger then presided over the invasion of Zululand in January 1879. Meanwhile, Wassall was still with the mounted infantry at the outbreak of that Anglo Zulu War. He was attached to No. 3, the central column. Accompanying that column into Zululand was General Thesiger. Just a few months previously, upon the death of his father, he had inherited his late father's title, Lord Chelmsford. On the morning of the 22nd of January 1879, Chelmsford, believing that the main Zulu army had been sighted, split his force. He personally led half the column eastwards to engage the enemy and ordered the remainder to pack up their camp and follow as soon as possible. But unbeknown to Chelmsford, the Zulus had outmanoeuvred him. Instead of lying to the east, where Chelmsford was heading, they had moved unobserved to the north of the British camp that he had just departed. The camp at the base of a mountain named Isandlwana. Young Samuel Wassall, along with the other members of the mounted infantry, had been ordered to stay at the camp. Later that morning, the Zulu army, numbering nearly 20,000 men, attacked. Now, I've gone into detail about the Battle of Isandlwana in a previous episode, so if you want to learn more about it, then please check it out at the end. I'll post a link in the description. Here, however, is the top line to put this current story about Samuel Wassall into context. Basically, the British force of 1,800 men, including over 700 redcoats from the 24th Regiment of Foot, were overwhelmed by a brave and highly disciplined Zulu attack. Almost the entire British garrison was wiped out, and as the scale of the defeat became apparent, British, white colonial and local African troops tried to break out and reach the safety of the British depot at Rorke's Drift, about 5 miles away, across the Buffalo River in the British colony of Natal. Famously, they included 2 officers, Lieutenants Melville and Coghill, who tried, controversially, to carry the Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment, to safety. However, the fleeing British now found that the rough track back to the border at Rorke's Drift had already been cut by the well-executed Zulu encirclement. The only route to safety lay across 6 to 7 miles of broken countryside towards the Buffalo River and that relative safety of the British colony of Natal. Wassall, on his Basotho pony, joined the throng, desperately trying to pick their way through aloe plants, thorn bushes, rocky ground and streams cutting across the landscape. Many of the British infantry fleeing on foot were swiftly overtaken by the Zulus. In small groups they stood back to back, defending themselves with bayonets, knives and even their bare fists. only 55 Europeans escaped the carnage, and every single one of them was on a horse. And even those mounted men were struggling to make headway in this rough countryside. If a horse slipped, the Zulus were in before the rider could remount. This escape route is now known as Fugitives Trail, and it ends at the Buffalo River at Fugitives Drift. Eventually Wassall reached that drift, which marked the border between British Natal and Zululand. Not that it felt like safety at that particular moment in time. Thanks to recent rains, the river was in flood, with a current running 6 or 7 miles an hour, far too fast for a man to swim across. The only hope was to hang on to a horse and let its strength power across the fast-flowing water. But even then, many horses hit submerged rocks and were swept downriver along with their riders. With Zulus closing in, as men milled about on the bank trying to work out where and how to cross, Wassall noticed something worrying. Very worrying indeed. Despite the fast-flowing current, Zulu warriors were linking arms and somehow using their elbows to swim across the buffalo, and were now gathering in small groups on the opposite bank. Suddenly, Natal wasn't looking so safe, and their escape route was closing shut. The fugitives had to get across the river before the Zulus did in strength. For 22-year-old Samuel Wassall, it was now or never. He urged his hardy pony into the water, and he'd almost reached the other side when he heard a cry for help. It was another mounted infantryman, a man from his own 80th Regiment of Foot, Private Westwood, who was struggling in the water close to the Zulu side of the river. Wassall later said that the temptation to ignore his cries and continue across to safety was, in his words, great indeed. But looking back at the bank he'd just left, he saw Zulus descending to the water's edge, stabbing at anything that moved. He knew that his comrade would either drown or be speared. Either way, he was a goner. Unless... Samuel Wassall turned his horse midstream and went back to the Zulu bank. Tying his horse to a tree, he then leapt into the water and swam towards Westwood. Grabbing him, Wassall now swam back to the shore, only to find that the current had swept them a little way downstream. Incredibly, despite all those Zulus starting to arrive at the bank, the two men managed to reach the horse, and scrambling up into the saddle, Wassall grabbed Westwood's arm, and together the two men and the horse plunged back into the river. And as they did so, the Zulus rushed up to the bank and opened fire with their rifles and flung their spears towards the struggling men. Holding Westwood by the arm and under assault from those Zulu rifles and spears, they made their way across in what must have seemed like an eternity. But eventually they reached the Natal bank. Wassall's luck held once more, as dodging small groups of Zulus who'd also made it across and were now seeking to mop up any exhausted survivors, he spurred his horse up the embankment. Exhausted by his exertions and pumped up with adrenaline, he cast off his helmet and red tunic, and then with Westwood on his saddle behind him, he galloped away to safety. Others arriving at the Natal bank weren't so lucky. Lieutenants Melville and Coghill made it across, only to be killed by Zulus, who'd also made it across the Buffalo River. Further upstream, over 4,000 men from the Zulu Reserve, who hadn't played a major role at Isandlwana, crossed the Buffalo into British territory, against their king's orders, and proceeded to attack the small British garrison at Rorke's Drift. That epic defence by 140 men against 4,000 attacking Zulus that lasted the best part of 12 hours through the night was made famous in the film Zulu. The Battle of Isandlwana was the greatest defeat the British Army ever suffered at the hands of a non-European army in Africa. It was a stunning victory for the Zulus. With the British now on the defensive, Wassall was attached to the northern column of Colonel Evelyn Wood. Just 2 months later, he was caught up in another reversal for the British at the hands of the Zulus, this time at Kloban. Once more, Samuel Wassall managed to escape death. The following day, he was present at the British victory at the Battle of Kambula. He would serve throughout the rest of the war, including the very final battle and British victory at Ulundi in July of that year. Just 3 weeks before that final battle, where thousands of Zulu warriors had fallen in a brave but forlorn effort to save the old Zulu order, Private Samuel Wassall had appeared in a newspaper back in Britain. Shortly after their successful escape from Isandlwana, Private Westwood was recovering at a field hospital and had shared the story of his rescue with 2 officers. Having heard his story, they passed it up the chain of command. Now, there were many tales of bravery and lucky escapes emanating from Isandlwana, and various survivors were being hailed as heroes who deserved Britain's highest medal for valour, the Victoria Cross. Supporters of Melville and Coghill were even campaigning for a change in the rules to allow a posthumous award to the two men who were being lauded for trying to take the Queen's colour to safety. That particular campaign was rebuked by Chelmsford's eventual successor in Zululand, General Sir Garnet Wolseley. The British public's favourite general at that moment in time, Wolseley was firmly of the view that officers on horseback should not have fled the field, leaving their men to their fate. The idea that such actions could then be sanctioned by the award of the VC was, he felt, out of step with the public mood. So Coghill and Melville's families had to wait nearly 30 years, when the rules were changed, to finally gain their posthumous VCs. Other officers, such as Horace Smith-Dorrien, who had also ridden to safety and survived, were similarly passed over for Britain's highest medal for gallantry. And by the way, Smith-Dorrien, who was just 20 when he escaped from Isandlwana, would go on to command 2 corps of the BEF at Mons and Le Cateau in 1914. In fact, only one Victoria Cross was awarded to a living person for an act of bravery at Isandlwana. Private Samuel Wassall. On the 17th of June 1879, just 3 weeks before the final battle at Ulundi, his award was confirmed in the London Gazette. He was presented with his Victoria Cross while still serving in South Africa on the 11th of September by none other than General Sir Garnet Wolseley himself. Wassall was 22 years and 9 months old. Alongside him was Robert Jones of the 24th Foot, who'd been awarded his VC for his bravery during the defence of Rorke's Drift. And if you're wondering whether Sir Garnet was upset at having to present a VC to a man who'd escaped Isandlwana on horseback, it seems not. After all, there was a crucial difference between him and men like Coghill, Melville and Smith-Dorrien. Private Samuel Wassall was not an officer. Nor was he the only member of the 80th Regiment to be awarded the VC during the Anglo Zulu War. Colour Sergeant Anthony Booth would also receive the honour for commanding a fighting retreat following the Zulu surprise attack at the Battle of Intombi. Wassall left the army the following year after 6 years' service, and returning to England, went on the reserve list. He moved to Barrow-in-Furness in Lancashire. Moving in with his older brother and his family in Exmouth Street, he got a job at the shipyards that dominated the town. And he would remain working for VS&M Naval Construction, later Vickers Shipyard, for the next 40 years. He married Rebecca Round from the Tipton Dudley area of the Black Country, where he'd been living prior to joining the army, and together they would bring up a family of 7 children in Lion Street, Barrow. A popular and respected man both at the shipyard and in the community, Wassall was invariably asked to place the wreath on behalf of ex-servicemen at the town's war memorial on Armistice Day in the 1920s. Samuel Wassall VC died on the 31st of January 1927, aged 70. He was buried at St James's Church in Barrow with full military honours. His coffin was borne by 4 sergeants, one of whom was representing his old regiment, the 80th, which by then was the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment. Rebecca would outlive him by 10 years, and when she died, she was buried in the same grave. In 1985, a new marble headstone was erected by his old regiment to honour one of their 13 Staffordshire Regiment VC heroes. His Victoria Cross is on display at the Staffordshire Regimental Museum at Lichfield. About 10 years ago, a road in the cathedral city was named after him, Wassall Lane. So it seems that heroes from long ago aren't completely forgotten, if you look hard enough. Now, if you, like me, are fascinated by the Anglo Zulu War and the films Zulu and Zulu Dawn, then check out my Zulu Wars playlist, because I have made over 20 videos. They include various battles, the ride of Melville and Coghill, what happened to the VC recipients after Rorke's Drift, some sad stories there, a fact check of the film Zulu, and the man who claimed to be the only British soldier captured by the Zulus. There's a link appearing now and in the description below. A big shout out to my patrons and supporters for enabling me to research and tell these stories. And a big thanks to you too for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.